The fire took everything from Jackson Anders in a single cruel hour, leaving him standing in ashes with nothing but the clothes on his back and a borrowed horse that someone pitied him enough to loan. He watched from the ridge as smoke still curled from what had been his ranch house in Douglas, Arizona. The September heat of 1883 making the air shimmer like water over the blackened timbers that had once sheltered 3 generations of his family. His father's pocket watch, his mother's wedding ring, the deed to the land that his grandfather had fought Apaches and rattlesnakes to claim, all of it gone, reduced to cinders and ash that scattered on the hot desert wind. Jackson was 24 years old and had never known failure before this moment. The ranch had been prosperous, his cattle bringing good prices in Tucson, his horses known for their endurance across 3 territories. But a lightning strike in the dry season had been all it took. The fire spread faster than he could react, jumping from the barn to the house to the storage sheds in minutes. He had barely gotten the horses out before the roof collapsed. Now he stood on borrowed land with borrowed time. Knowing the bank would come calling for payments, he could not make on a property that no longer existed. The first night he slept under the stars with a saddle for a pillow, staring up at the vast Arizona sky and wondering how a man rebuilt from nothing. The second night he did the same. By the third day, reality settled into his bones like the dust that coated everything in this corner of the territory. He needed shelter before the winter came, and winter in the high desert could be brutal, despite what folks from back east believed about Arizona. The nights already carried a chill that promised frost, and the old-timers in town spoke of early snow in the mountains that would soon spread to the valleys. He found a spot near Whitewater Draw, where his property line met the edge of what had once been productive grazing land. The earth there was soft enough to dig but firm enough to hold, and a natural depression in the hillside offered some protection from the wind. With a borrowed shovel and hands that blistered and bled, Jackson began carving out a dugout shelter, cutting into the earth like some animal burrowing for survival. It was humbling work, degrading work, the kind of shelter that settlers had used 30 years ago when first claiming this land. But pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. The dugout took shape slowly, a rectangular hole cut 6 feet into the hillside, barely tall enough for him to stand upright. He fashioned a frame from cottonwood branches scavenged along the creek bed, draped canvas he had traded his good boots for, and piled earth over the top for insulation. It was dark, cramped, and smelled of damp soil, but it would keep him alive. Barely. He dug a small fire pit near the entrance, careful to angle it so smoke would draw out rather than suffocate him in his sleep. At night, rats scratched in the walls, and he could hear coyotes singing their lonesome songs across the draws and washes. Douglas was a small town, barely more than a collection of adobe buildings and false-fronted stores clustered around a single dusty street, but it was the closest thing to civilization for 50 miles in any direction. Jackson went there only when necessary, too ashamed of his reduced circumstances to meet the eyes of men who had once respected him. He sold what little he could salvage, took odd jobs when they were offered, and tried to calculate how many months he had before winter truly set in, and whether he could possibly build something more substantial than a hole in the ground before then. It was on one of these trips to town, in early October when the cottonwoods along the San Pedro River were just beginning to turn gold, that he first saw Tabitha Prescott. She was loading supplies into a wagon outside Kellerman's general store, lifting 50-pound sacks of flour like they weighed nothing, her movements efficient and strong. She wore a simple calico dress faded from too many washings. Her dark blonde hair pulled back in a practical braid, and she had the kind of face that would have been pretty if it were not so serious, so focused on the work at hand. Jackson would have walked past without a word, his shame too heavy for polite conversation, but one of the flour sacks tore as she lifted it, white powder exploding across the wagon bed and her dress. She swore, actually swore, a word his mother would have washed his mouth out for saying, and he found himself stopping, almost smiling for the first time in weeks. "That is going to be a mess to clean," he said before he could stop himself. She looked at him, really looked at him, her eyes a startling green that reminded him of new grass after rain. "Are you going to help or just stand there making observations?" He helped. They salvaged what flour they could, sweeping it into a spare crate she had in the wagon, and she told him her name, and that she ran a small ranch about 3 miles south of town with her father. Her mother had died 2 years ago, consumption, and it had been just the two of them since, trying to keep a failing cattle operation afloat in a territory that seemed determined to crush anyone who was not strong enough or stubborn enough or lucky enough to endure. "What about you?" she asked, brushing flour from her sleeves. "I have not seen you around Douglas before." "I am Jackson Anders," he said, and watched recognition flicker across her face. Everyone in the territory had heard about the fire by now. "I had a ranch north of here," had being the relevant word. She did not offer sympathy, which he appreciated more than she could know. Instead, she looked at him with a directness that was almost unsettling. "So what are you doing now?" "Surviving," he said. "Barely. That is more than some can say." She finished loading the last of the supplies, tying down the canvas cover with practiced efficiency. "My father needs help repairing our fence line before winter. If you need work, come by tomorrow. Pay is not much, but it includes meals." It was charity dressed up as employment, and they both knew it, but Jackson found himself nodding anyway. Pride was still a luxury he could not afford, and the prospect of regular meals was too tempting to refuse. He showed up the next morning, as the sun was breaking over the Chiricahua Mountains, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson. The Prescott Ranch was modest, a low adobe house with a sagging porch, a barn that needed new shingles and corrals that held maybe 20 head of cattle, all of them looking as worn and weary as everything else in this country. Tabitha's father, William Prescott, was a thin man in his 50s with the persistent cough of someone whose lungs were slowly giving out. He shook Jackson's hand with a grip that was still firm despite his obvious illness. "Tabitha says you know cattle and horses," William said, his voice raspy. "That true? I grew up on a ranch, sir. Worked it until it burned." William nodded, asked no more questions, and set him to work. The fence line ran for miles, much of it collapsed or broken, posts rotted through or pulled loose by cattle pushing against wire in search of better grazing. It was hard, monotonous work, digging new post holes in earth baked hard by the sun, stringing wire that cut through gloves and into flesh, but Jackson welcomed it. Physical labor kept his mind from dwelling on what he had lost, kept him from sinking into the kind of despair that swallowed men whole in this territory. Tabitha worked alongside them, and Jackson quickly learned that she was every bit as capable as any ranch hand he had ever employed. She could sink a post, string wire, and hammer staples with the same efficiency her father showed, never complaining about the heat or the dust or the blisters that must have been forming on her hands just as they were on his. At midday, she brought water and cornbread, and they ate in the shade of the wagon, saying little, too tired for conversation. "You are living rough," she said on the third day, not quite a question. Jackson took a long drink from the canteen before answering. "I have a dugout near Whitewater Draw. It keeps the rain off. And when the snow comes, I will manage." She looked at him with those direct green eyes. "That is foolish. A dugout will not protect you when the temperature drops below freezing. You will freeze or suffocate from your own fire trying to stay warm." "What would you have me do?" The words came out sharper than he intended. "I have no money to build anything better. I barely have money for food. The dugout is what I can afford, which is to say nothing." "Then build a cabin," she said, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. "There is timber up in the mountains. You have 2 hands and enough daylight left in the season if you start now. I cannot build a cabin alone before snow, and I cannot afford to pay anyone to help me." Tabitha was quiet for a moment, staring out across the brown grass and scattered mesquite. "I will help you," she said finally. "On my days off from working this place. My father does not need me every day, and I know how to swing an axe and lift a beam." Jackson stared at her, certain he had misheard. "Why would you do that?" "Because I watched my mother die in a house that was too cold and too drafty, and I would not wish that on anyone. Because you are a decent man who has had bad luck, and decent people should help each other when they can." She met his eyes. "And because I am stubborn, and when I decide something needs doing, I make sure it gets done." He wanted to refuse, wanted to say he did not need charity from a woman he barely knew, but the practical part of his mind, the part that had kept him alive these past weeks, overruled his pride. "I would be grateful for the help," he said quietly, "more grateful than I can say." "Then we start next week," Tabitha said. "Bring your axe and your determination, and we will see what we can do." They finished the fence work by the end of October, just as the first real cold snap settled over the territory. Jackson had earned enough to buy basic supplies and replace the boots he had traded away, and William Prescott paid him with surprising generosity considering the obvious financial struggles of the ranch. But it was the promise of help building a cabin that occupied Jackson's thoughts as he returned each night to his miserable dugout, planning and calculating what would be needed. Tabitha arrived at Whitewater Draw on a Sunday morning with a wagon loaded with tools and a determination that bordered on fierce. She surveyed the land with a critical eye, walking the property until she found a spot she deemed suitable, a level area with good drainage and protection from the north wind. "Here," she said, driving a stick into the ground. "This is where your cabin goes." They spent that first day cutting timber from the pine forests that covered the slopes of the Swishell Mountains, loading the wagon with logs that would form the walls of the cabin. Tabitha wielded an axe with the same efficiency she did everything else, her strikes clean and powerful, never wasting motion or energy. Jackson found himself watching her when he thought she was not paying attention, admiring the strength in her shoulders, the concentration on her face, the way she brushed sweat from her forehead with the back of her wrist. "You are staring," she said without looking up from the tree she was notching. "I am just impressed," he said honestly. "Most women I know would not know which end of an axe to hold. Most women you know probably wore corsets and worried about their complexions," Tabitha replied, grinning now. "My mother taught me that being useful was more important than being decorative. Besides, out here, decorative gets you killed. Useful keeps you alive." They hauled the first load of timber back to the building site as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, stacking the logs carefully to let them settle. "This is going to take weeks," Jackson said, looking at the small pile that represented hours of hard work. "Maybe months." "Then we better not waste time talking about it," Tabitha said. "I will be back next Sunday, and the Sunday after that, and every Sunday until it is done, and maybe a few weekdays too when I can spare them." True to her word, she returned the following Sunday and the Sunday after that. They fell into a rhythm, working dawn to dusk, stopping only for water and the simple meals she packed in her wagon. They cut timber, notched logs, laid the foundation with stones pulled from the dry creek beds that crisscrossed the property. Jackson had built before, had helped his father raise barns and repair houses, but never had he worked with someone whose skill matched his own so perfectly. They moved together like dancers, anticipating each other's needs, working in comfortable silence broken only by the sounds of axes biting wood and the distant calls of ravens. November brought colder weather, frost on the ground in the mornings and clouds building over the mountains that promised snow. They worked faster, driven by the changing season, and the cabin began to take shape. 4 walls of stacked logs rose from the foundation, gaps chinked with mud and grass to keep out the wind. They cut openings for a door and a single window, framed them with timber they shaped using tools borrowed from William Prescott, who asked no questions about why his daughter was spending so much time helping a man she barely knew. On a Tuesday in mid-November, when Tabitha should have been working her own ranch, she arrived at mid-morning with news. "The fence work is caught up, and Father is having a good week. I told him I would be here for the next few days straight. We need to get the roof on before the weather turns." They worked those next days with an urgency bordering on desperation. The roof was the most critical component, the piece that would mean the difference between shelter and merely 4 walls. They laid beams across the top of the walls, covered them with smaller branches woven tight, then layered on sod cut from the better watered areas near the draw. It was exhausting, dirty work, hauling earth and plants onto a roof, tamping it down, making sure it would shed water and hold heat. Tabitha's hands bled from the rough work, and Jackson insisted she wrap them in cloth torn from his spare shirt. "I have had worse," she protested, but she let him wrap her hands anyway, and when his fingers brushed her skin, something passed between them, a current of awareness that had been building for weeks but neither had acknowledged. "Thank you," he said, not letting go of her hands, "for all of this. I could not have done it without you." "I know," she said, but she was smiling and she did not pull her hands away. "You are welcome, Jackson Anders." They stood there in the gathering dusk, hands clasped, the half-finished cabin behind them and the first stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Jackson wanted to kiss her, wanted it with an intensity that surprised him, but he held back, uncertain if she would welcome it or if it would ruin the easy partnership they had built over these weeks of shared labor. Tabitha solved the dilemma for him, rising on her toes and pressing her lips to his, brief and soft and full of promise. "I have been wanting to do that for a while," she said when she pulled back, her cheeks flushed. "I hope that was all right." "That was more than all right," Jackson managed, and then he was kissing her properly, his arms around her waist, her hands in his hair, weeks of growing attraction and unspoken affection pouring out in that single moment. They broke apart, breathless, and Tabitha laughed, a sound of pure joy that Jackson had not heard from her before. "We should probably finish the cabin," she said. "It is going to snow soon." The first snow came 3 days later, light flurries that dusted the ground but melted by midday. It was a warning, a reminder that winter was no longer approaching but had arrived. They worked through it, finishing the roof, hanging the door that Jackson had built from planks traded for labor in town, installing the window frame with its precious glass that had cost him 2 weeks of wages. Tabitha helped him build a stone fireplace in one corner, mortaring rocks with mud that would harden as it dried, fashioning a chimney that drew properly and would not fill the cabin with smoke. On a cold Sunday in late November, with snow falling steadily outside and the temperature dropping toward freezing, They stood inside the finished cabin and surveyed their work. It was small, barely 12 feet by 16 feet, with a dirt floor and walls that were rough-hewn and unfinished. But it was solid and weatherproof and infinitely better than the dugout that Jackson had been calling home. The fireplace drew perfectly, filling the single room with warmth, and the window let in enough light to see by during the day. "We did it," Tabitha said, wonder in her voice. "We actually did it." "You did it," Jackson corrected. "I could not have built this without you. I would be freezing in that dugout if you had not decided to be stubborn and help me." She turned to face him, her expression serious. "I did not do it just to be charitable, Jackson. I did it because I wanted to spend time with you. Because from the moment I saw you in town, covered in dust and too proud to ask for help, I knew you were someone worth knowing, someone worth caring about." His heart hammered in his chest. "I have nothing to offer you, Tabitha. I have this cabin and 20 acres of land and debts I am still trying to pay off. I lost everything in that fire, including my future. You have yourself," she said simply. "You have your strength and your determination and your good heart. That is more than most men can claim." She stepped closer, taking his hands in hers. "I am not a woman who needs fancy things or pretty words. I need someone who will work beside me, who will not break when times get hard, who will build something real and lasting. I think you might be that person." Jackson pulled her close, holding her like she was the most precious thing in the world, because suddenly she was. "I am falling in love with you," he said, the words feeling both terrifying and absolutely right. "I think I have been since you swore at that torn flour sack." Tabitha laughed against his chest. "I am falling in love with you too," she said. "And I think we are both crazy, but maybe crazy is what it takes to survive out here." They sealed it with a kiss, longer and deeper than the first, a promise and a beginning all at once. Snow continued to fall outside, covering the desert in white. But inside the cabin they had built together, Jackson Anders finally felt warm. Winter settled over Douglas with a surprising ferocity that year. Snow fell regularly, unusual for southern Arizona, but not unheard of in the higher elevations where Jackson's land sat. The cabin proved its worth, keeping out the wind and holding heat from the fireplace, and Jackson spent the long winter nights planning for spring, for rebuilding what he had lost, for a future that suddenly seemed possible again. Tabitha came to visit when the weather permitted, riding the 3 miles from her father's ranch with supplies and news, and a smile that made even the coldest days bearable. Sometimes she stayed for a few hours, helping Jackson plan the new barn he would build in spring, the corrals he would construct, the herd he would slowly accumulate. Other times she stayed until dusk, and they would sit by the fire talking about everything and nothing, learning each other's histories and hopes and fears. He learned that her mother had been a schoolteacher from Philadelphia who met William Prescott when he was working as a guard on a stage line, that they had married within a month and moved west with dreams of building an empire. Those dreams had never materialized, worn down by drought and disease, and the simple hardship of trying to extract a living from unforgiving land. But they had been happy, despite the struggles. Tabitha had been their only child, born late in their marriage, and her mother had taught her to read and write and think for herself, skills that were rarer in women than Jackson would have liked. She learned that Jackson's family had been ranchers for 3 generations, that his grandfather had come west after the Civil War looking for a fresh start, that his father had expanded the operation until it was one of the most successful in the territory. Jackson had been set to inherit it all, to carry on the legacy, until the fire took it away in a single afternoon. He told her about the guilt he felt, the sense that he should have been able to prevent it somehow, that he had failed the generations that came before him. "You cannot control lightning," Tabitha said gently, her hand in his. "You cannot predict when disaster will strike. All you can do is survive it and rebuild. That is what you are doing." "We are rebuilding," he corrected. "I could not do this alone." In January, William Prescott's cough worsened, and Tabitha spent more time at her father's ranch, nursing him through long nights when his lungs filled with fluid and he struggled to breathe. Jackson helped when he could, riding over despite the cold to tend the cattle and repair whatever needed fixing, trying to ease the burden on Tabitha's shoulders. He grew to respect the older man's quiet dignity, the way he faced his own mortality without complaint, the genuine affection he showed for his daughter. "You are good for her," William told Jackson one afternoon when Tabitha had gone into town for medicine. "She has been alone too long, carrying too much weight. She needs someone to share it with." "I intend to be that person, sir," Jackson said, "if she will have me." William smiled, though it turned into a cough that shook his thin frame. "She will have you. I have seen the way she looks at you. It is the same way her mother used to look at me, like you are the only solid thing in a world that keeps shifting." The old man was right. As winter slowly gave way to early spring, as the snow melted, and the first green began showing in the draws and washes, Jackson and Tabitha's relationship deepened into something neither could imagine living without. They made plans, tentative at first and then with increasing confidence, for combining their properties, for pooling their resources, for building something together that would be stronger than either could create alone. On a warm day in March, with wildflowers beginning to bloom across the desert and the sky that brilliant blue that only happens after winter storms have scrubbed it clean, Jackson rode to the Prescott Ranch with a ring he had bought with the last of his savings. It was simple, just a gold band with no stones, but it was all he could afford, and he hoped it would be enough. He found Tabitha in the barn, tending to a cow that was having trouble calving. She was covered in blood and fluid, her sleeves rolled up past her elbows, her face set in concentration as she worked to help the struggling animal. Jackson waited, knowing better than to interrupt, and watched as she finally pulled the calf free, clearing its nose and mouth until it drew its first breath. The relief on her face was beautiful. "That is the third one this week," she said, washing her arms in a bucket of water. "If they all survive, we will have a decent herd come fall." "Tabitha," Jackson said, and something in his voice made her stop and turn to face him fully. "I know the timing is not perfect. I know your father is sick, and I am still barely scraping by, and neither of us has any certainty about what the future holds. But I also know that I love you more than I thought it was possible to love another person. I know that I want to spend every day of the rest of my life working beside you, building something real with you, facing whatever comes with you at my side." He pulled the ring from his pocket, dropped to one knee in the straw and mud of the barn floor. "Will you marry me, Tabitha Prescott? Will you take a chance on a man who has nothing but a small cabin and big dreams and a heart that belongs entirely to you?" Tabitha's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling, that brilliant smile that transformed her serious face into something radiant. "Yes," she said, pulling him to his feet and kissing him hard. "Yes, I will marry you, Jackson Anders. I will marry you and help you rebuild and build something new, and we will make it work through sheer stubbornness if nothing else." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her hand. They stood there holding each other while the cow licked her new calf clean, and the spring sun streamed through the barn door, and Jackson felt something he had not felt since the fire, a sense that the future was not just uncertain hardship, but also possibility and hope. They were married in April in the small church in Douglas, with William Prescott walking his daughter down the aisle despite the effort it took him to make the journey. The ceremony was simple, attended by the few friends and neighbors they had, but it felt sacred and profound in a way that had nothing to do with the trappings and everything to do with the promises they made to each other. Jackson wore the only suit he owned, brushed clean and mended where moths had gotten to it. Tabitha wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her taller frame, and she was the most beautiful thing Jackson had ever seen. "I promise to work beside you in good times and bad," he said when it came time for vows. "I promise to build you a life worthy of your strength and courage. I promise to love you every day in every way I know how. I promise to stand with you no matter what comes," Tabitha replied, her voice steady despite the emotion shining in her eyes. "I promise to be your partner in all things, to share the work and the rewards. I promise to love you with everything I am, for all the days we are given." They sealed their vows with a kiss, and the small gathering erupted in applause and good-natured cheers. The celebration afterward was held at the Prescott Ranch, with food brought by neighbors and music provided by a fiddle player who had traveled from Tombstone for the occasion. They danced in the dusty yard as the sun set, and Jackson held his wife close, marveling at how his life had transformed from desperate solitude to partnership and love and belonging. William's health declined rapidly after the wedding, as if he had been holding on just long enough to see his daughter settled. He passed away in his sleep on a warm night in May, with Tabitha holding his hand and Jackson keeping vigil beside her. They buried him on the ranch he had worked so hard to maintain, under a cottonwood tree where he could hear the water running in the creek during spring floods. Tabitha grieved deeply, but without theatrics, her sorrow expressed in quiet tears and long silences rather than dramatic displays. "He was ready," she told Jackson a few days after the funeral. "He told me as much. He said he was grateful to go knowing I would not be alone, that I had someone who would take care of me, though I told him I was perfectly capable of taking care of myself." "You are," Jackson agreed. "But that does not mean you have to." They combined the two properties formally in June, filing papers in town that merged the Prescott Ranch with Jackson's land, creating a single operation that stretched across several hundred acres of grazing land and timber holdings. It was still modest by the standards of the large outfits that dominated the territory, but it was theirs, built on hard work and sacrifice and the determination to survive. Jackson rebuilt the barn that had burned, raising the frame with help from neighbors who owed William Prescott favors, or who simply believed in helping a young couple trying to make a start. Tabitha worked beside them, and Jackson never ceased to be amazed by her strength and capability. She could lift beams, drive nails, and work from dawn until dusk without complaint, and the men who helped came to respect her as much as they respected any of their male counterparts. By fall, the new barn stood complete, and they had acquired a small herd of cattle purchased with money from the sale of some of the timber rights on the mountain property. It was not much, but it was a beginning, a foundation they could build on. They worked the cattle together, branding and vaccinating and moving them to better pasture, their partnership in life extending naturally to their partnership in work. The cabin that they had built together the previous fall became their home, small but comfortable, and Tabitha added touches that made it more than just shelter. She sewed curtains for the window, planted a garden near the creek that produced vegetables through the summer, built shelves to hold the books her mother had left her. Jackson added a bed he built himself, a table and chairs traded for labor, a rocking chair he surprised her with on her birthday. They fell into the rhythms of married life, learning each other's habits and quirks, navigating the inevitable disagreements that arose when two strong-willed people tried to build a life together. Tabitha was stubborn and independent, used to making decisions on her own, and sometimes she chafed at having to consider another person's opinions. Jackson was proud and still carried the weight of his failure with the fire, and sometimes he pushed himself too hard trying to prove he could provide adequately for his wife. But they learned to talk through their frustrations, to compromise when necessary and stand firm when it mattered. They learned that love was not just the passion of their early courtship, but also the choice to stay and work through difficulties, to forgive mistakes and celebrate successes, to be partners in every sense of the word. Winter came again, and this time Jackson faced it not in a desperate dugout, but in a warm cabin with a wife he loved more each day. They spent the long evenings by the fire, Tabitha reading aloud from her books while Jackson worked on tack that needed repairing or carved small items from wood scraps. Sometimes they just talked, making plans for spring, dreaming about the future they would create together. "I want children," Tabitha said one night in January, the statement coming out of a comfortable silence. "Not right away necessarily, but eventually. I want this place to be filled with life and noise and the chaos that children bring." Jackson pulled her closer, his arm around her shoulders. "I want that too. I want to build something that lasts beyond us, something we can pass on to the next generation. I want our children to grow up knowing they are loved, and that they come from people who worked hard and did not give up even when things seemed impossible." "Then we will have that," Tabitha said with the confidence that Jackson had come to associate with her. "We will build it just like we built this cabin and the barn and everything else, one piece at a time, with hard work and determination." Spring brought growth in more ways than one. The cattle herd increased with the arrival of healthy calves. The garden that Tabitha had expanded produced abundantly. And in late March, Tabitha told Jackson that she was pregnant, that they would have a child before the year was out. Jackson's joy was immediate and overwhelming. He picked her up and spun her around, mindless of propriety or her protests that he would make her dizzy. "We are going to be parents," he said, wonder in his voice. "We are going to have a family." "We are," Tabitha agreed, laughing at his enthusiasm. "Though I plan to keep working as long as I can. I am not an invalid just because I am carrying a child." She was true to her word, working the ranch well into her pregnancy, only slowing down in the final months when the summer heat and her growing belly made the physical labor too difficult. Jackson did his best to take over her share of the work, rising before dawn and working until after dark, determined that she would not have to strain herself unnecessarily. Neighbors, remembering how the young couple had helped William Prescott and supported each other through hardship, came by with food and offers of assistance, creating a network of community that felt like family. The baby arrived on a cool night in October, almost exactly 2 years after Jackson and Tabitha had started building the cabin together. The birth was long and difficult, as first births often were, and Jackson paced outside the cabin while the midwife from town worked inside, feeling helpless and terrified in equal measure. When he finally heard the cry of his child, strong and healthy, he sank to his knees in relief. The midwife emerged an hour later, smiling. "You have a son," she said, "and your wife is doing well. She is asking for you." Jackson entered the cabin to find Tabitha propped up in their bed, exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in soft cloth. She looked up at him with such love and pride that his throat tightened with emotion. "Come meet your son," she said softly. He crossed to the bed, looking down at the small face peeking from the blanket, the tiny fists waving in the air, the eyes that were trying to focus on this new world. "He is perfect," Jackson whispered. "Absolutely perfect. We should name him William," Tabitha said. "After my father, William Jackson Anders. What do you think?" "I think it is the perfect name," Jackson said, carefully taking his son in his arms for the first time, marveling at the weight of him, the realness of him. This was his child, his and Tabitha's, a new life they had created together. "Welcome to the world, William. We have been waiting for you." The years that followed were full and good, the kind of life that Jackson had dreamed of during those dark days in the dugout, but had not dared to believe he could achieve. The ranch prospered slowly but steadily, the cattle herd growing, the land improving as they learned its rhythms and requirements. They built additions onto the cabin, expanding it room by room as their family and their means grew. William proved to be a healthy, active child, curious about everything and fearless in the way of small boys. He learned to walk holding onto the corral fence, chasing after the chickens Tabitha had acquired, falling and getting back up with the resilience of youth. Jackson taught him to ride almost as soon as he could walk, setting him on a gentle mare and leading them around the yard, watching his son's face light up with joy. When William was 2, Tabitha became pregnant again, and this time the pregnancy was easier, her body knowing what to expect. Their daughter arrived in the spring, a beautiful baby with her mother's green eyes and her father's dark hair. They named her Sarah Rose, and she was doted on by her older brother, who took his role as protector seriously, despite being barely old enough to understand it. The cabin that Jackson had built in desperation, that Tabitha had helped him finish before snow, became the center of a thriving household. They added a proper wooden floor, plastered the walls, installed real glass windows that let in light and could be opened in summer. The single room expanded to 4, with separate bedrooms for the children and a larger living area where the family gathered in the evenings. Neighbors became friends, and Douglas grew from a small outpost to a real town with schools and churches and businesses that served the growing population. Jackson and Tabitha became respected members of the community, known for their hard work and their willingness to help others who faced hardship, remembering their own struggles and wanting to ease the path for those who came after. One evening in late summer, with William now 5 and Sarah 3, Jackson and Tabitha sat on the porch they had added to the front of the cabin, watching their children chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. The day had been hot, but the evening was pleasant, a light breeze carrying the scent of pine from the mountains. "You ever think about that first winter?" Tabitha asked, her hand in his. "When you were living in that dugout and the future seemed impossible?" "I think about it often," Jackson admitted. "I think about how close I came to giving up, to just walking away from this land and starting over somewhere else. If you had not stopped me that day in town, if you had not decided to help a stranger build a cabin, I do not know where I would be now. Probably dead in a ditch somewhere, or working as a hired hand on someone else's dream." "You would have survived," Tabitha said with certainty. "You are too stubborn to die in a ditch, but I am glad I stopped you anyway. I am glad I decided to be nosy and interfering and offer help you did not ask for." Jackson raised her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles. "I am grateful every day that you did. You saved my life, Tabitha, not just from freezing in a dugout, but from becoming someone bitter and broken. You gave me hope when I had none, partnership when I was alone, love when I thought I would never feel anything but grief again." "We saved each other," Tabitha corrected. "I was lonely too, drowning in responsibility and watching my father die, with nothing to look forward to but more of the same. You gave me a future worth fighting for, a partnership worth building, a love I did not know I needed until I found it." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the children play, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling in for the night. The cattle lowed in the distance. A horse whinnied from the barn. Crickets began their evening song. It was a symphony of home, of life built from nothing, of dreams realized through hard work and determination, and the decision to help a stranger on a dusty street in a small town. William ran up to the porch, breathless and excited. "Papa, I caught 3 fireflies. Can I keep them?" "Let them go, son," Jackson said gently. "They need to be free to fly and find their families. You can catch them again tomorrow night." The boy nodded, understanding even at his young age the importance of freedom and family, and ran back to release his captives. Sarah toddled after him, her laugh bright and clear in the warm evening air. "We did well," Tabitha said softly. "Look at what we built, this life, this family, this home." "We did well, Jackson. We did better than well," Jackson replied, pulling her close. "We did something remarkable. We took nothing and made it into everything." The years continued to pass in a blur of seasons and growth. The ranch expanded as they purchased adjoining land from neighbors who moved on or passed away, until the Anders spread covered several thousand acres of grazing land and timber holdings. The cattle herd grew to several hundred head, enough to provide a comfortable living and put money away for the children's futures. William grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved the land as much as his parents did, who spent hours exploring the draws and washes, learning the location of every water source and game trail. Sarah was her mother's daughter, strong-willed and capable, equally comfortable helping with the cattle or learning to read from the books that filled the shelves her father had built. When William was 7 and Sarah 5, Tabitha gave birth to their third child, another son they named Thomas after Jackson's father. The boy was quiet and observant, content to watch and learn before attempting anything himself, and he balanced the family perfectly. The cabin expanded again to accommodate the growing family, until it bore little resemblance to the desperate structure Jackson had thrown together in a race against winter. Jackson built a proper ranch house, using techniques he had learned over the years and materials he could finally afford. It was a beautiful building, 2 stories of solid construction with a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides and windows that caught the morning sun and the evening breeze. They moved in on Tabitha's 30th birthday, and Jackson carried her across the threshold while the children laughed and cheered. "This is not the cabin we built together," Tabitha said, looking around at the spacious rooms and fine furnishings. "But I loved that cabin. It represented everything we were fighting for." "The cabin is still there," Jackson reminded her. They had kept the original structure, using it now for storage and occasionally as a bunkhouse for seasonal workers. "It reminds us where we came from, what we survived. But this house represents where we are now, what we built together. Both are important." The community around Douglas continued to grow, and Jackson became involved in local politics, serving on the school board and helping to organize the Cattlemen's Association that protected the interests of ranchers across the territory. Tabitha became known for her charitable work, helping families who faced hardship, remembering her own struggles and determined that others would not suffer alone if she could prevent it. They celebrated their 10th anniversary on a warm spring evening, with the children asleep upstairs and the house quiet around them. They sat on the porch, much as they had that evening years ago, watching stars appear in the darkening sky. 10 years, Tabitha marveled. "It feels like both forever and no time at all." "It feels like exactly as long as it has been," Jackson said, practical as always. "And I would not change a single day of it. Well, maybe a few of the days when the cattle got out and we spent 14 hours rounding them up. Those days I might change," Tabitha laughed, the sound still making his heart lift the way it had that first day in town. I would not change anything either. Even the hard days, the days when we fought or when money was tight or when the children were sick and we did not sleep for 3 nights straight, those days made us who we are. Who we are is lucky, Jackson said seriously. Lucky to have found each other, lucky to have this life, lucky that a stubborn woman decided to help a desperate man build a cabin before snow. It was the smartest thing I ever did, Tabitha said. That and deciding to love you. As the children grew older, Jackson taught them everything he knew about ranching and the land, about treating animals with respect and understanding the weather patterns, and reading the signs that nature provided. Tabitha taught them to read and write and think critically, to question assumptions and stand up for what was right even when it was difficult. Together, they raised children who were confident and capable, who understood the value of hard work and the importance of helping others. William, at 15, was already taking on significant responsibility around the ranch, working alongside his father during roundups and trail drives. Sarah, at 13, had developed a gift for handling horses, gentling even the most difficult animals with patience and understanding. Thomas, at 10, showed an aptitude for numbers and planning, keeping track of the herd records and helping his mother with the ranch accounts. One evening in late fall, with the first cold snap of the season making the fire necessary, the family gathered in the main room of the house. Jackson told stories of his grandparents and parents, of the early days in the territory, of the fire that had taken everything and the dugout where he had lived in desperation. "I cannot imagine you living in a hole in the ground," William said, trying to picture his confident, successful father in such reduced circumstances. "It was not a choice I wanted to make," Jackson said honestly, "but it was the choice I had. Sometimes life takes everything from you, and you have to find a way to survive with nothing. The important thing is not giving up, not letting circumstances defeat you. And finding someone stubborn enough to help you," Tabitha added, winking at her husband. "That does not hurt either." "Mama helped you build our cabin?" Sarah asked. She had heard the story before, but children never tired of hearing about their parents' early days. "Your mother did more than help," Jackson said seriously. "She made it possible. I could not have built it alone, certainly not before winter came. She worked alongside me every day, lifting logs and raising beams and doing work that many women would not have been capable of. She saved my life in more ways than one." "We saved each other," Tabitha said, correcting him as she always did. "It was a partnership from the beginning." Thomas, always the thoughtful one, asked, "Were you scared? When you had nothing and winter was coming?" Jackson considered the question carefully. "Yes," he said finally. "I was terrified, not just of freezing or starving, but of failing, of not being able to rebuild what I had lost. I was scared that I would spend the rest of my life as someone who had once been successful but could not recover from disaster." He looked at Tabitha, love clear in his expression. "But then I met your mother, and the fear became less important than the hope. Less important than the possibility of building something new." The children grew to adulthood, each finding their own path while remaining connected to the land and the family that had shaped them. William took over more and more of the ranch operations, preparing to eventually inherit the responsibility Jackson had once thought lost forever. Sarah married a neighboring rancher's son, a good man who appreciated her strength and capability, and they established their own spread with help from both families. Thomas attended college in Tucson, studying agriculture and business, planning to return and help modernize the ranch operations. Jackson and Tabitha grew older together, their hair graying, their bodies showing the wear of decades of hard physical labor, but their love never diminishing. If anything, it deepened with time, the passionate romance of their youth maturing into something more profound, a partnership so complete that they often communicated with glances rather than words, understanding each other's thoughts before they were spoken. On their 20th anniversary, Jackson took Tabitha back to the original cabin, the structure they had built together in that desperate race against winter. It was weathered now, the logs darkened with age, but it was still solid, still standing strong against the elements. "Do you remember the day we finished the roof?" Jackson asked, standing inside the small space that seemed even smaller now that they were accustomed to the larger house. It was snowing, and we were frozen and exhausted, but we stood right here and looked at what we had accomplished. "I remember thinking that I had never been happier," Tabitha said. "Despite being cold and tired and worried about 100 different things, I was happy because I was with you, because we had built something together, because I knew I had found someone I could face anything with." "I thought the same thing," Jackson said, pulling her close. "And I was right. We have faced everything together, good and bad, and we have built a life that is more than I ever dreamed possible when I was living in that dugout, wondering if I would survive the winter." They stood in the cabin, holding each other, remembering the hope and desperation and determination that had brought them together. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, and somewhere in the distance, cattle called to each other. It was the sound of home, of life, of dreams realized through hard work and partnership and love that refused to give up. The years continued their steady march, bringing both joys and sorrows. Jackson's mother, who had been living in California with relatives after the fire, returned for visits, marveling at what her son had rebuilt, grateful to the daughter-in-law who had made it possible. She passed away peacefully in her sleep during one of these visits, and they buried her next to William Prescott under the cottonwood tree, expanding the family cemetery that marked the generations who had worked this land. Grandchildren arrived, first from Sarah and her husband, then later from William as he married and started his own family. The big house filled with the sound of children again, and Jackson and Tabitha found themselves in the roles of grandparents, spoiling the little ones in ways they had never indulged their own children, delighting in the innocence and joy that young ones brought to every day. They celebrated their silver anniversary surrounded by family and friends, with a party that lasted well into the night and included neighbors from 50 miles around. Someone gave a speech about the young couple who had arrived in Douglas with nothing but determination and had built an empire through hard work and partnership. Jackson stood to respond, his arm around Tabitha's waist. "We did not build an empire," he said, looking around at the assembled crowd. "We built a home. We built a family. We built a life worth living. And we did it together, one day at a time, one decision at a time, choosing each other and this land and this community again and again." He turned to Tabitha. 25 years ago, I was a man who had lost everything, living in a hole in the ground with no future I could see. Then a stubborn, beautiful woman decided I was worth helping, worth saving, worth loving. Everything good in my life traces back to that decision." Tabitha stood, taking his hand. 25 years ago, I was lonely and scared, watching my father die and facing a future alone. Then a proud, desperate man let me help him, let me work beside him, let me love him. Everything good in my life traces back to that choice." She looked out at the crowd. "We all face hardship in this territory. We all have moments when giving up seems easier than going on. The lesson of our story is simple. Don't give up, and don't be too proud to accept help when it is offered. Community, partnership, and love can overcome almost anything." The celebration continued, but Jackson and Tabitha eventually slipped away, walking together through the night to the original cabin. They sat on the small porch Jackson had added years ago, looking out over the land they had claimed and held and improved. "You ever regret it?" Jackson asked. "The life you could have had if you had not stopped to help a stranger that day in town. You could have sold your father's ranch, moved to a city, had an easier life." "Never," Tabitha said without hesitation. "Not for a single moment. This life, hard as it has been sometimes, is the life I was meant for. You are the partner I was meant to have. I would choose it all again, every struggle and every triumph, every hard day and every joyful one." "So would I," Jackson said, kissing her forehead. "1,000 times over. I would choose this life, this love, this partnership." They sat in comfortable silence, two people who had found each other at the right moment, who had chosen to build something together rather than face their struggles alone, who had created a legacy that would outlast them. The stars wheeled overhead, the same stars that had witnessed their first kiss in this very spot decades ago, and the land whispered its approval in the rustle of grass and the distant call of a night bird. As they approached their 30th anniversary, Jackson began to slow down, the decades of hard physical labor taking their toll on his body. His joints ached in cold weather, his back gave him trouble after long days in the saddle, and he moved with the deliberate caution of a man aware of his own mortality. But his mind remained sharp, and he took satisfaction in seeing William run the daily operations of the ranch with skill and wisdom. Tabitha remained strong, though she too showed the signs of aging, her hair now completely gray, her hands gnarled from arthritis, but still capable when necessary. She spent her time with the grandchildren, teaching them the lessons her mother had taught her, ensuring that another generation would grow up literate and thoughtful and prepared for whatever life brought them. One evening in early fall, 30 years almost to the day from when they had finished building the cabin, Jackson suggested they take a ride out to the old dugout site. They rode slowly, accommodating Jackson's stiff back, and Tabitha looked around with interest. She had seen the dugout only once, years ago, and it had long since collapsed, the earth reclaiming what had been carved from it. "There," Jackson said, pointing to a depression in the hillside that was barely visible among the grass and scrub. "That is where I lived that first winter. That is where I thought my life had hit bottom, where I could not imagine ever climbing back up." They dismounted, and Tabitha walked to the spot, looking at the barely visible remnants of that desperate shelter. "And now look at what you have," she said. "A beautiful home, a successful ranch, children and grandchildren who love you, 30 years of marriage to a woman who adores you. Not bad for a man who started with nothing but a hole in the ground." "Not bad for a man who started with nothing but a hole in the ground and a stubborn woman who refused to let him fail," Jackson corrected. "I could not have done any of it without you, Tabitha. Every success, every accomplishment, every good thing in my life is because you chose to help me that day in town, because you chose to love me even when I had nothing to offer." "You had everything to offer," Tabitha said, coming to stand beside him, taking his hand in hers. "You had your strength and your determination and your good heart. You had dreams and plans and the will to make them reality. You just needed someone to believe in you, to work beside you, to share the burden and the triumph. I am so grateful I got to be that person." They stood together, looking at the place where Jackson's lowest moment had occurred, and saw it transformed by time and memory into the foundation of everything that came after. The dugout had been necessary, had kept him alive long enough to meet Tabitha, to build the cabin, to create the life they now shared. Even desperate measures, even moments of profound failure, could be stepping stones to something better. I want to be buried here, Jackson said suddenly. When my time comes, I want to be laid to rest in this spot. It seems appropriate somehow to return to where the journey began. That will not be for many years, Tabitha said firmly, though they both knew it was likely sooner rather than later. But when the time comes, we will honor that wish. And when my time comes, I want to be beside you, just as I have been for 3 decades. They remounted and rode back to the big house as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson and purple. The ranch spread out before them, cattle grazing peacefully, the barn and outbuildings solid and well-maintained, the house glowing with light from the windows. It was a picture of prosperity and permanence, a testament to what 2 people could build when they worked together, when they refused to give up, when they chose love even in the face of hardship. Jackson lived for 5 more years, long enough to see his first great-grandchild born, long enough to know that the legacy he and Tabitha had built would continue for generations. He passed away peacefully in his sleep on a cold winter night, with Tabitha beside him, holding his hand as she had held it for 35 years of marriage. They buried him at the dugout site as he had requested, and Tabitha stood at the graveside with her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren surrounding her, a testament to the life they had created together. She spoke at the service, her voice steady despite her grief. Jackson Anders was a man who faced the worst that life could offer and refused to be defeated by it. He lost everything in a single day, lived in circumstances that would have broken a lesser man, and rebuilt not just his fortunes but his life, his family, and his legacy. He did it through hard work and determination and stubborn refusal to give up. But he also did it through love, through partnership, through the willingness to accept help and to give help in return. He was my partner, my love, my best friend, and the finest man I ever knew. This land, this family, this legacy we built together, it is his monument, far more meaningful than any stone marker. Tabitha lived for another decade, remaining active and involved in the ranch operations and the lives of her expanding family until the very end. When she passed away, also in her sleep, also peacefully, they buried her beside Jackson at the dugout site, reuniting them in death as they had been united in life. The grandchildren maintained the grave site, planting flowers that bloomed in spring and fall, ensuring the markers remained clear and legible. But the true monument to Jackson and Tabitha Anders was everywhere on the ranch in the cabin they had built together, now preserved as a reminder of where it all began, in the big house that sheltered multiple generations, in the cattle that bore their brand, in the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who carried their lessons and their values forward. William, now an old man himself, often brought his own grandchildren to the old cabin, telling them the story of how their great-grandparents had met and fallen in love and built something from nothing. He told them about the fire that took everything, the dugout where Jackson had lived in desperation, the woman who had offered help when it was most needed, and the partnership that had transformed 2 struggling individuals into something far greater than the sum of their parts. They taught us that hardship is not the end, William would say, standing in the cabin where his parents had first admitted their love for each other. They taught us that with hard work and determination and someone to share the burden, you can overcome almost anything. They taught us that love is not just passion and romance, but also partnership and commitment and the choice to stand together no matter what comes. The cabin stood for decades more, a physical reminder of what 2 people could accomplish when they refused to give up, when they chose to help each other, when they built something together that was stronger than either could have created alone. It became a place of pilgrimage for the family, a touchstone that connected them to their history, and reminded them of the values that had sustained the Anders family through generations. The land that Jackson had thought lost forever, that he had lived on in desperate poverty in a dirt dugout, became one of the most successful ranches in southern Arizona. The cattle operation expanded and modernized, adapting to changing times while maintaining the core principles of good stewardship and hard work that Jackson and Tabitha had established. The family grew and prospered, each generation benefiting from the foundation laid by two people who had met by chance and built a legacy through choice. And always, in the stories told and retold, in the lessons passed from parent to child, in the values that guided the family through triumph and hardship, the central truth remained. Jackson Anders had lost his home and lived in a dirt dugout. Tabitha Prescott had helped him build a cabin before snow. And in that simple act of kindness, that choice to help a stranger, that willingness to work beside someone who had nothing to offer but dreams and determination, they had created something that lasted long after they were gone. They had created not just a cabin or a ranch or a family, but a testament to the transformative power of love and partnership, and the refusal to give up even when circumstances seemed impossible. They had built a life together, one log at a time, one day at a time, one choice at a time, and it was a life that mattered, that made a difference, that left the world better than they had found it. That was their legacy, and it endured.